Good evening and welcome to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I'm Robert Spencer and we are continuing this week our series of profiles of and interviews with some of the most courageous freedom fighters on the scene today. And I tell you, I'm very excited about tonight's program. I'm very happy to announce that we have with us tonight none other than Ibn Warraq, one of the most renowned and incisive, innovative, and imaginative scholars of Islam on the scene today. And on a personal note, I can tell you that Ibn Warraq is one of my own heroes in the 90s, long before I was doing this work publicly, when I was consulting privately with some individuals and groups about Islamic issues. I read Ibn Warraq's book, Why I Am Not a Muslim, and I still recommend it as one of the most important books on such a range of issues that still affect us today, most notably the Islamic war on the freedom of speech, which you could say the first salvo of it in the modern age was the Salman Rushdie affair and the death sentence placed on Salman Rushdie by the government of Iran and the ensuing controversy in the Western media about whether it was proper to censor such works as Rushdie's Satanic Verses, which so offended some Muslims. Ibn Warraq's Why I Am Not a Muslim discusses that at length, as well as many related issues. I read it, I believe, in 1995 or 6, and it was transformative from my own perspective about Islam in so many ways. I never would have thought that I would meet Ibn Warraq, much less have a chance to interview him, and so this is a very great privilege for me. Also, I can tell you that Ibn Warraq is actually responsible for the fact that I no longer believe in Muhammad. That is an absolutely true statement. I never believed in Muhammad as a matter of faith, but I certainly believed that Muhammad had existed as a historical figure. And not accepting his claim to be a prophet, I merely had thought that he was a false prophet who made claims of getting revelations from God, when actually he wasn't getting any kind of actual revelation from God at all, but was representing his own thoughts or perhaps other things as coming from God. I was in The Hague, actually, speaking at a conference at which Ibn Warraq was also speaking, and this was in 2007, I believe, and I had just published a book, The Truth About Muhammad, in which I noted that the historical value of the earliest Muslim texts about Muhammad was indeed very shaky. But I was startled when I was walking with Ibn Warraq in The Hague, and he said that he didn't think Muhammad had existed at all. And I thought that was quite remarkable, and started to argue with him and say, well, wait a minute. There are these stories about Muhammad that are unflattering to him. Why would Muslims have preserved them if he was not a historical figure, that they simply had to explain these things away? And his response was quite illuminating on many levels, that there were, of course, what might embarrass modern people doesn't necessarily embarrass, didn't necessarily embarrass Muslims of the 8th or 9th centuries, and that these stories may well have been invented for other reasons that are less obvious to us. But in any case, the fruit of that conversation was that I began to investigate these questions in much greater depth, using Ibn Warraq's very important works, The Quest for the Historical Muhammad, which Quran, what the Quran really says, and others, to explore the historicity of the Islamic texts. The fruit of my investigations is in my own book, Did Muhammad Exist?, which makes the answer, shows that the answer very likely is that he did not. In any case, without further ado, Ibn Warraq, very happy to have you with us tonight. And first off, can you tell us why you think that Muhammad did not exist?
Well, I don't actually say in any of my books that he did not exist. What I do say is that our knowledge of of the person that is now known as Muhammad is very shaky, and that what is usually attributed to him, all the acts and deeds and sayings attributed to him, are probably later inventions. They may have been some shadowy figure like Robin Hood or Lancelot. But what we think we know about him is all invented, so all fabrication. So whether there was some historical tribal leader called Muhammad, possibly, I'm not even certain that there was that the name Muhammad is in itself not a later invention, retrojected onto into the past, onto some figure that who may have been a leader of a group of nomads. So,
Well,
sorry, go on.
no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but if I may play Muhammad's advocate for a moment, it's extraordinary what you're saying. And of course, I know that what you're saying is very true, but there'll be many Muslims watching this program, and they will say, well, wait a minute. The first thing is Muhammad is in the Quran, and so could you address that?
Well, Muhammad is only mentioned possibly 4 times, and it's not at all clear. We can say that the term Muhammad occurs in the Quran 4 times. It may well be is simply a term meaning the praised one, kind of adjectival phrase meaning the praised one, and may well have referred to Jesus Christ rather than somebody called Muhammad. So the connection between the so-called the life of Muhammad and the Quran is very tenuous, and it's in many ways, as Henry Lamens said almost 100 years ago, many obscure passages in the Quran are explained by later inventions of the details of the life of somebody supposedly called Muhammad. So all the obscure passages are interpreted as being the life of someone called Muhammad, but they're not necessarily anything to do with somebody called Muhammad. So there are vague references, and we don't know who they refer to. There are all sorts of loose pronouns floating around. It's not at all certain that it has anything to do with somebody we know as Muhammad.
And even the Quran itself, of course, it's widely assumed that it is a product of the 7th century, that it was delivered or written by or caused to be written by Muhammad, who died in 632, and then the Caliph Uthman had all the various copies collated, coordinated, the variants burned in the year 653, and then the product of that distributed to the Muslim provinces. And so many historians, as well as, of course, Muslims all around the world, would say that the Quran has existed in more or less its present form since the year 653. But that also is open to question, is it not?
Yeah, yes, all our sources about any of the details of the origins of Islam, the origins of the Quran, the life of Muhammad are incredibly late. That's to say, nearly 200 years after the supposed events. So we cannot base anything firm on such late and tendentious sources. Tendentious in the sense that they're obviously stories that have been invented in order to back up some law that somebody wanted to pass, to give religious sanction to perhaps some customs like child marriage. Child marriage is not mentioned in the Quran, but it's mentioned in the so-called traditions, the hadith. And there were probably these stories in the hadith, the traditions were invented in order to justify the existence of the institution of child marriage. So they invent the story of Muhammad marrying an 8-year-old, 9-year-old girl called Aisha. She was whisked away carrying her dolls, according to the biography of Muhammad and stories in the hadith. But these are all very late stories, and we know that these stories were invented for all sorts of political, social, cultural reasons. And there are many individuals in Islamic history who would who confess to having invented thousands of hadith. So we can't really rely on them to construct what really happened. And there is no external epigraphic, numismatic, or archaeological evidence for Muhammad, which is contemporaneous. And the non-Muslim sources are very ambiguous. They're not at all, they don't give the details. We don't know if they really refer to somebody called Muhammad. There are anomalies uh, in the coins and so on. All sorts of, you have coins with uh, which are clearly Christian origin, and yet they bear the name Muhammad, but they're often rather late. So again, we don't know whether it's just a term meaning the praised one. If it is supposedly Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, then why do these coins bear Christian crosses and so on? So there are all sorts of anomalies. Uh, so we can't rely on the non-Muslim sources, and the epigraphic numismatic evidence is also rather ambiguous and rather scant.
So when you say that the sources for the Hadith are late, you're saying that there is absolutely nothing in the 7th century that bears witness to a figure anything like the Prophet of Islam. Is that right?
Correct, indeed. The earliest biography we have is supposedly by somebody called Ibn Ishaq, but in fact we don't even have his biography. We have his biography as redacted by somebody called Ibn Hisham, who died over 200 years after the death, supposedly in 632, the Christian era, or the Common Era as it's now called.
So you're saying that the earliest biography of Muhammad dates from 2 centuries after his supposed death.
Yes, indeed. That's correct.
And so we are supposed to believe, if we accept the canonical Muslim account, or even the basic historical account that most historians take for granted, then we have to be putting ourselves in the position of believing that Muslims had this material about Muhammad, that they saved it, but they said nothing about it and gave no hint of having it at all, and only started talking about it 2 centuries after his death.
Well, they only started recording it 2 centuries after his death. Let's put it that way. That's more charitable. So
well, that is more charitable, but what I mean is there's no mention of Muhammad in the earliest accounts of the Arab conquests in the 7th century, either from the non-Muslims or from the Muslims themselves, correct?
I don't know. I think there's one obscure, maybe, is it the Armenian one? Does it not mention somebody called Maometto?
Yes, but he doesn't say anything about what he was like or who he was. When we compare
exactly.
that to the proliferation of material in the Hadith that comes later, then the question becomes, if they had it, where did they put it? Why didn't they say anything about it?
That's exactly right. They are much, much later. And it's not just the lateness. It's not only the lateness of the sources, which is a problem. The problem is, of course, non-confirmation from the outside the Islamic tradition, but also the nature of the evidence we have, the Islamic sources. They're often contradictory. They contradict one another. They're incoherent. Sometimes they're suspiciously detailed.
Can you explain what you mean to the non-specialist? What does suspiciously detailed mean? I mean, I would think a Muslim hearing that would say, see, you're just finding fault, Ibn Warraq, because after all, the detail comes from the fact that these things were recorded by eyewitnesses. And so, what do you mean suspiciously detailed?
Well, the later the historian like Al-Waqidi, for example, gives more details than the earlier ones. So how is that? How is that possible? That the later historians should have more detail when the earlier ones don't even mention him. The Ibn Ishaq doesn't mention the details that you find in Al-Waqidi, for example, who's much later. So it's all very puzzling. So it's the nature of the sources. It's clear that the biography of Muhammad, as presented by Ibn Hisham and Ibn Ishaq, if you like, is clearly calqued, that's to say, modeled on what the writer of this biography thinks a prophet did do and should have done. So you have Muhammad doing the kind of things that Moses did, like go up into the mountains and receive a revelation from an angel, have a holy city, and have a holy book. This is exactly modeled on Moses, who is mentioned, in fact, I forget how many times. Is it over 100 times? I forget now the
Well over
details.
100, I believe.
Well, you over 100 times in the Quran, whereas Muhammad is only mentioned 4 times. So it's the nature of the sources as well, and um, they resemble rather the storytellers, the tales spun by the storytellers, the kusas as they were known, as they were used to as inventing stories for the edification of any particular crowd. And they bear a strong resemblance to the tales spun by the storytellers. So again, without any kind of confirmation, corroboration from outside, these stories will always remain rather one needs to remain very skeptical of their historical value.
Yes, indeed. You also mentioned that they were contradictory. Now, can you explain a little bit more why, if this whole thing is invented, and if Muhammad was cooked up in order to serve a political purpose and to buttress the political agenda of the new Arab empire, why would they devise contradictory material?
Well, they've just remained that people, the earlier the earlier collectors of the hadith collect one set, and then the later ones collect another set. Without there's no attempt at sifting out what seems rather odd or suspicious. They've just left it all in. In fact, there isn't one particular story, for example, about the collection of the Quran. There are several, in fact. Some say the Quran was finally put together in the time of Uthman. Others say it was Abu Bakr, and then there are some common elements in the stories, but there are, was it Abu Bakr or was it Uthman, and so on. There are ways, of course, one can always interpret away any kind of contradiction, but the fact remains that they do contradict each other.
Also, weren't there warring factions? There were factions that were vying for political power in the early days of Islam, and so they would devise stories of Muhammad in order to support their own positions.
Yes, indeed. There was a big row about who was the real successor, supposedly, to the Prophet. So one group will invent a story saying, look, it is quite clear that Ali was designated as the successor to Muhammad. That's this beginning of the Shiites, and the others would say no, it was quite clearly Abu Bakr or later on Omar and Uthman. So each group was trying to prove its credentials. It was trying to convince the people that they had the legitimacy and the others didn't. So they're bound to invent a story, a hadith, saying, look, this is the story. Muhammad quite clearly gives Ali the succession.
One of the things that I find remarkable about this is that we have, for example, Bukhari, the Imam Bukhari in the 9th century, who collected together the hadith collection that is considered by Muslim scholars to be the most reliable. And it is said that Bukhari traveled around the Islamic world and collected 300,000 hadiths, 300,000 traditions of Muhammad's words and deeds. And from them, he sifted out 3,000 that he deemed authentic on various grounds that we can discuss in a moment. But that means that he rejected 297,000 stories of Muhammad as being false. And so it seems as if even the Muslim scholars acknowledge that the false stories about Muhammad were circulating in far, far, far greater numbers than the true ones. And on what basis did Bukhari sift out what he considered to be the real ones from what he thought were the fake ones?
Well, I don't know the details of how he set about it at all, in fact.
Well, I was actually thinking of the Isnad chain.
Oh, chain of transmitters. Yes, but I mean, if you can invent the contents of a hadith tradition, then surely you can also invent the isnad, the chain of transmitters. That's to say, which in the best cases go back to something that Muhammad himself is supposed to have said, and then has been handed down over 2 centuries in a chain of supposedly reliable people, witnesses. But
so that depends on their having perfect memories, perfect recall, and the perfect ability to pass on these traditions to somebody else, who in turn has perfect memory, perfect recall, and the perfect ability to pass on the tradition.
Yes, indeed. The other reason for being skeptical of the whole notion of oral tradition is that there have been a great number of books on oral tradition, on modern books on memory, for example. I quote some of them in my book, Quest for the Historical Muhammad. Oral tradition is by its very nature unstable. It's totally unstable. If you think of the children's game of passing down a message around a classroom, for example, you whisper one thing into your neighbor, and that neighbor whispers it to his neighbor, and so on, and it goes around the class, and by the time it's come back again, the story has changed drastically, dramatically. It's quite extraordinary. You just have to do that simple experiment, and suppose that to think you're made to believe that somehow over 200 years people were able to reliably transmit stories from one person to another. It just doesn't add up. It's just simply does not work like that.
Indeed. Yes, go on.
Sorry, it's just a question of human memory. I mean, we know that memory play you false all the time. Extraordinary how there have been so many studies about, especially on memory, nothing to do with historical memory, but just simply memory in a modern clinical study. He was astonished how distorted one's own memory in one's own lifetime can be. You must have, I suspect you have some kind of memory of how you thought something was X, Y, or Z, and then it turned out to be not the case.
The existence of Muhammad, as a matter of fact. That I thought at one time was X, Y, and Z, and now I think quite differently about it, thanks to you, sir. But in any case, we should emphasize at this point, I think, that we're talking about memory because this had to have been oral tradition. There is no indication of any serious attempts or any surviving attempts to record this material on paper and in books and so on until Ibn Ishaq and then Bukhari and Muslim later. And of course, as you pointed out, we don't have Ibn Ishaq anyway. We only have the recension of Ibn Hisham. And so if the Muslims had this material, which, as we've previously discussed, would involve the fact that they never said anything about having it and never spoke about their founding figure all through the first great proliferation of the Arab Empire and the Arab conquests of North Africa and the Middle East and Persia and so on, there's nothing, virtually nothing, about Muhammad, that at this time they were secretly, or sub rosa, passing this material on orally, and then it was only written down in the 9th century. And so we are supposed to believe, if we accept the canonical account of Islamic history, that this transmission was done by people who said nothing about it in the early stages, nothing about it for decades and decades after the time of this great transformative founding figure's life, and then after having committed it to memory flawlessly and perfectly, passed it on flawlessly and perfectly to others who wrote it down 2 centuries later. It strains credulity on so many levels.
Sorry.
Yes, not at all. In any case, I think that it is also important to note that there are a great deal of other elements of the story of Islam, the story of the Quran, the story of the life of Muhammad, that give evidence of it having been composed from without rather than having been recorded from memory and collected together. And could you elucidate some of those as well?
Yes, I was just going to come to that. In fact, we have more and more evidence that the people who collected the Quran were working with a written text and not with an oral tradition, because, well, without getting too technical, some of the variants that are found and recorded by the Muslims themselves can only make sense in face of a written text. They cannot possibly the variants cannot be explained by so-called oral tradition. These variants can easily be shown if we assume that the people were working with a written text which was imperfectly pointed, that's to say, had the dots and dashes added to it, which would enable us to read it correctly. But since the early manuscripts were not pointed, there are all sorts of variations possible. And these variations are possible only because they were working with the written text. It's got nothing to do with an oral tradition.
And so we're talking about, I want to emphasize, we're talking about the Quran here, not Hadith. And so we're not talking about written texts of the stories of Muhammad, which we know were written down much later, but texts of the Quran. And when you say they don't have the dots and dashes, that has to do with the fact that Arabic doesn't write vowels, and so these texts did not have the vowels noted, and people would not know how to understand them. And also many consonants are identical within the Arabic written language. And so without the points that show to help one distinguish one consonant from another, the text is essentially incomprehensible or variant to such a degree as to allow of multiple meanings. And we'll be returning to this question. We have to take a break at this point. This is ABN's Jihad Watch program, and I am Robert Spencer with our very special guest, the renowned Islamic scholar Ibn Warraq, and we'll be right back after this.
If you'd like to support ABN's ministry, you can give us a call at 248-416-1300, or you can visit our website at www.abnsat.com. ABN appreciates your support and donations.
Good evening and welcome back to ABN's Jihad Watch program. I am Robert Spencer, and we are in the middle of a very extraordinary program with the world-renowned Islamic scholar Ibn Warraq, son of a paperhanger, and we are very privileged to be hearing tonight about the origins of Islam, the very questionable historical situation regarding the life of Muhammad and regarding the Quran. And I wonder if you could tell us, sir, about the Quran a little bit more. It opens up a fascinating world when we realize that the earliest versions, the earliest copies of the Quran did not have the pointing that would enable one to distinguish various consonants from one another, to know what vowels were to be put in various places, and so on. And that being the case, it becomes a very variant text. Combine that with the fact that there is so much in it that is not, contrary to its own claims, pure Arabic and clear language. It opens up a realm of possibilities that scholars have only just begun to explore, and I understand that you are one of them. Can you tell us a little bit about what you have found in your explorations of the original text of the Quran?
Well, first of all, we find, for example, that many of the stories found in the Quran have been taken over in a rather strange fashion, as I will explain, from the Old Testament, especially, particularly the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. And some passages from Psalms, for example.
Now, you're not talking about the retellings in the Quran of
Yeah.
Old Testament stories, right? You're talking about something else. Is that right?
I'm talking about, yes, the stories found in the Quran which have been taken over from the Old Testament.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Often they have been taken over, as found in the Quran. There are certain elements which are missing, which don't make sense on their own. If you go back to the original Hebrew, or in some cases, in occasional cases, the Aramaic, you realize that some crucial element has been left out. For example, in the Quran, the story of Joseph and his brothers, when Joseph is tempted, there's an attempted seduction by the Pharaoh's wife of Joseph, and in that story, suddenly we are told that she has a knife in her hand, and we don't really know where this knife comes from and what it is for. But if you look at the original story, as told in for example, the Old Testament, and as developed in the Midrashim, you realize that the knife was given to Joseph in order to cut some fruit that he had been given earlier. But this is not mentioned. So we're left with a kind of obscurity until you look at the original story. There are many stories like that which are often explained away. For example, if you look at the Quran, and there's a certain verse which talks about supposedly a city called Bakka. And all Quran translations that I've looked at they will have a footnote saying another name for Mecca. No explanation is given. If you look at the classical Arabic commentaries, no explanation is given. It says, oh, this is an alternative name for Mecca, but it is complete nonsense. And if you look at it carefully, you realize that it is, in fact, a quote from a passage in the Psalms where he's talking about the valley of Becca. And it's got nothing whatsoever to do with a place called Mecca. And not only that, if you look carefully at the sentence which contains the sentence Baka in the Quran, and you compare it with the sentence as it occurs in the Psalm, there are incredible structural similarities in the words used, the vocabulary and the syntax. So it is much more than just a coincidence. So these are some of the things. And more recently, I've been working with a scholar working in Germany called Christoph Luxemburg, who takes obscure, hitherto at least, obscure passages in the Quran, and then he tries to show that some of these words make more sense as Aramaic, Syriac, which is a form of Aramaic, spoken by the Eastern Christians, than the Nestorians. These words make more sense if you translate them back into Syriac, and you get a better understanding of the obscure passage, which is quite an extraordinary discovery, really. Large parts of the Quran, according to Luxemburg, were written originally in Aramaic and then badly misunderstood and translated into Arabic. So what on earth is going on here? I mean, this is quite extraordinary.
Yes.
Now, his work has aroused a lot of controversy, but there are more and more serious scholars within Orthodox Islamic studies who are beginning to take his arguments seriously, including Arabic scholars. I can think of Professor Munta Yunus at Cornell University. His first language is Arabic, and he's convinced of that Luxemburg is onto something, and he has used Luxemburg's methodology to elucidate some passages himself. He has elucidated some obscure passages in the Quran himself, which I shall be publishing his 2 articles in my next anthology. So there are certain historians who also find the whole idea quite plausible, because up to now the actual real linguistic background to 7th century Syria and Palestine has been neglected, grossly neglected, and it's extraordinary. They've looked at the Quran in isolation without relating it to what John Wansbach called the sectarian milieu from which the Quran was born, out of which the Quran came. It's time that people looked carefully at both the linguistic and the socio-cultural background to the Quran.
Thank you. Now, shifting gears quite a bit in the remaining time that we have, I did want to touch on some of your other extraordinary books, most particularly Why the West is Best. This is a book that I read several months ago and found it to be a bit of a departure in the first place from your other work, like The Quest for the Historical Muhammad and so on, and even Why I Am Not a Muslim, in that it doesn't deal with Islam and historical or philological issues as such, but rather with much broader questions that come from the interaction between the Islamic world and the West, and whether it is permissible or whether it is desirable to even ever suggest that one culture might be superior to the others. Why would you say? Could you give us an executive summary of why the West is best?
Well, yes, my other work is really to do with Western civilization, Western culture generally, and I find that very refreshing from talking about jihad the whole time. And I feel very passionately about it. We are obviously so much better off in the West, yet many liberal left-wing intellectuals pretend this is the most evil civilization that has ever existed. But if you look at the history, the story is otherwise. For example, take slavery. Okay, of course slavery was awful, but it was Christians who first went about abolishing it, and it continued unabated, and it continues to this day in the Islamic world. And slavery has existed in every single civilization known to man, and yet it is only Western slavery which is criticized. What about Islamic slavery, which started much, much earlier, which started in the 7th century, 8th century, and went on much longer, and in some countries it still exists. And it was far more cruel, far more devastating, because they tended to castrate their slaves at a young age, and there was a very high mortality rate. I'm going to be writing about this one of these days soon. And the eunuchs were needed for the harems in the Islamic world. And yet, what happened to all these millions of slaves? More slaves were imported and taken into the Islamic world than ever crossed the Atlantic into the New World. We have the descendants of the black slaves in the West, in the United States. But what happened to the descendants of the slaves in the Islamic world, the black slaves? Well, they've died out because of their treatment, and of course, for a very obvious reason, many of them were castrated, so they could not propagate their people. The same thing with imperialism and colonialism. Well, the Islamic Empire was just as imperialistic, in fact, far more devastating in that it destroyed several civilizations. The Western colonial powers, not only that they did not destroy, for example, Indian civilization, they actually encouraged the study of it. They were the first ones to look at the origins of Buddhism, for example, to preserve the Buddhist monuments, the Islamic monuments. They're the ones who went about saving these monuments. For example, Lord Cromer in British India spent millions of pounds preserving the extraordinary monuments in the whole of India. So this is some of the things that I talk about, and one of the greatest values, one of the things that the Rushdie affair brought home to me was the value of the freedom of expression, which is essential for progress, for democracy, for scientific research, and so on. And yet we are not defending it as we should. And so my book, Why the West is Best, is also a defense of freedom of expression, which is a very precious freedom, and we've got to defend it.
Absolutely. I think it's not overstated to say that it is the freedom upon which all our other freedoms depend, because if we cannot speak out against a tyrannical ruler, if we cannot register our dissent from the accepted dogmas of the society, be they secular or religious, then a tyranny can descend and does descend and has descended in many, many cases in human history. Now, all this that you're saying, however, it calls to mind one glaring question, is that why this self-loathing in the West? Why are Westerners the sons and heirs, the children of the greatest civilization on the planet? Why are they in such a suicidal funk? What brings it about?
It is a very odd phenomenon. I'm not sure that I have a very clear-cut answer to that. It partly derives from a strength of Western civilization, which is self-criticism. But unfortunately, self-criticism has turned into self-loathing. And of course, since the 19 since the Second World War, we've been teaching three generations of children how awful the West has been, how we colonize everyone, and so on. And the opposite, the story of other civilizations, the other colonialisms, the other imperialisms like the Islamic one, and other slave systems are not mentioned at all. Or when they are mentioned, their role is minimized or denied even. I had a phone call actually from somebody who was at Wayne, I think some place in Michigan.
Wayne State University.
That's it. She said that she was appalled when she discovered that the teacher was just spewing forth anti-Western hatred onto young, impressionable people. There was no attempt to relativize anything. It was ever, in absolute terms, the West was evil. The West did this. The West did that. And when she objected, she was told to shut up. Finally, she went and bought a copy of my book, Defending the West, a critique of Edward Said. She couldn't take it, and she said she would throw her out if she continued to make trouble for her. This is just oddly enough, I had this conversation about 3 hours ago.
That's extraordinary. I think that what we're dealing with is a peculiar and toxic combination. On the one hand, the West's, as you noted, a virtue, the capacity for self-criticism, and also it has to be remarked that Islamic culture has shown not only an absolute resistance to self-criticism, but an anxiety and a constant impulse to cover over the evils of its own culture and its own religious teachings and so on, to whitewash and to dissemble about the evils done by Muslims in the name of Islam and so on. And so you combine those two together, and you get the complete exoneration of Islam for any connection not only historically with slavery or with imperialism, but also with contemporary Islamic jihad terrorism and so on, while everything is the fault of the West. And what's really most remarkable about this, I think, is that you have the President of the United States and now two successive administrations, one Republican and one Democrat, Bush and Obama, both assuming tacitly that the conflict between the West and the Islamic world is all the fault of the West, and thus it is within our power to bring harmony to the relationship by winning hearts and minds, building schools, building roads, building hospitals in Afghanistan and so on, and thereby showing that we're really not such bad people at all, completely discounting the possibility that the Islamic world may hate the West for reasons of its own that come from its own beliefs and assumptions and are not subject to our control, no matter how nice we are. And so the question of why the West is best is one that really can only be answered in the West because it can only be asked here. The Islamic world will only take for granted that the Islamic world is best, but will not allow for any genuine discussion or any actual inquiry into why that may be so. Ibn Warraq, are you still with us, or have we lost the signal?
No, I'm there. I'm there.
Oh, excellent. There he is. So I didn't see you there for a minute. I started to get worried. But in any case, what I found, one of the things that I found most fascinating about your book, Why the West is Best, was the extended disquisition on the city of New York. And can you explain a little bit about how New York City is kind of a paradigmatic example of why the West is best?
Yes, if anybody's ever lived in New York, they would know the extraordinary amount of energy and variety, and it caters to every kind of taste: highbrow, lowbrow, middlebrow. It's got art, it's got music, it's got every kind of music possible: jazz, funk. I went to a concert of Johnny Winter last week. 2 weeks earlier, I was at a opera of Berlioz's The Trojans, and a couple of weeks earlier, I was at a Rolling Stone concert. So there's everything imaginable, and yet people take it for granted. These activities, the fact that we can choose, we can do evening classes, we can improve our knowledge, we can improve our skills, we can learn more things. These are based on certain principles. There's this wonderful institution called the New York Public Library, which is extraordinary. We're so lucky to have it here in New York. It's democratic. Any person can go there and order a book, and it gets delivered to your desk within an hour and a half, right? Sometimes even less than that. Holdings of several million books, of every kind. This is because the West, and especially New York and the New York Public Library, values knowledge. It values access to knowledge, and it should be made available to everyone. And this is embodied in this wonderful institution called the New York Public Library. So there is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has got these extraordinary works of art, including, incidentally, Islamic art. They have a new wing devoted entirely to Islamic art. They make no discrimination. They're inclusive. That's what's so great about New York. It's inclusive. It embraces everyone. Just join in. They want people to join in. There's every kind of ethnic kind of food. You can have lectures at the Japan Society. You can have a dance evening of Indian classical music at the Asian Society, and so on. It is the most extraordinary place which exemplifies all the possibilities, all the energy, and all the inclusiveness, and the joy. It's a culture of joy and self-fulfillment. If you're religious, you can go to any of the hundreds of different churches in New York. If you use the term spiritual in a wider sense, there is enough food for one's soul in New York to last a lifetime. From classical music to choral concerts to religious paintings, these are all spiritual activities. This is so extraordinary. So this is a metaphor for the West generally. It's not just New York, in fact. These things are available everywhere in the West. There's much more concentrated form, of course, in New York.
And so you would say that such a city, with all its facets and all the culture and all the respect for learning, with all the possibilities for the fulfillment of the human spirit, is not the kind of city that would have or could have or has developed in the Islamic world. Is that correct?
It might have existed at one point. I don't know. I mean, people tend to romanticize perhaps a bit Baghdad, Alexandria at some stage, and so on. But at this moment, no, there's no city like that in the Islamic world at all. No, they're becoming more and more narrow. You cannot find a university in an Islamic country which can offer the kind of courses such a deep and profound level as you find in the Western universities, offering, in fact, people from the Islamic world come to the West to study Islam, to study Indian art or Indian music or literature, Sanskrit, and so on. They don't have the kind of facilities. They don't have the same kind of attitude to learning and to intellectual curiosity as the West does. So they cannot possibly be the same. You're restricted. The Islamists don't even like you enjoying music, certainly not infidel music. They don't, theater is banned, representational art is banned, cinema is heavily censored, literature is heavily censored, and so on. So you cannot possibly, how can artists function under censorship without freedom of expression? So we come back to the freedom of expression.
Absolutely. Well, Ibn Warraq, we are reaching the end of the hour, and I want to say that it's been an extraordinary privilege and pleasure for us to have you on the program, for me to have you on the program here tonight. Your contribution to the defense of Western civilization and to our understanding of the nature of Islam, the magnitude of the jihad threat, these things cannot be underestimated. And all free people owe you a great debt of gratitude. I owe you certainly a personal debt of gratitude for all that you have taught me. And so I thank you for your work. Thank you for coming on to the program. And long may you wave. I look forward to your next book and your next 5 after that. And thank you very much for all that you have done and continue to do for the defense of the truth and the illumination of the truth. And so this has been ABN's Jihad Watch program. Thank you for watching. I'm Robert Spencer. Good night.